Divorce is often a quiet death, a private funeral for a future that will never be. But for Josephine Shaw, it was a public execution. At the most prestigious charity gala of the year, her ex-husband Brendan Cole, a man whose tech empire she helped build from their tiny apartment, stood on stage wrapped in the arms of a model half her age. He toasted his newfound success, his freedom and his upgrade, all while Josephine watched from the shadows, a ghost, at a feast celebrating her own demise. She lost her home, her friends, and her dignity that night. What Brendan didn't know, what no one could have possibly imagined, is that while he was collecting sports cars and accolades, Josephine was about to inherit a secret legacy so vast it would make his entire fortune look like pocket change. This isn't a story about revenge, it's a story about rebirth. The ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of champagne bubbles, couture gowns, and the carefully modulated laughter of New York's elite. For Josephine Shaw, it felt like the coldest, most beautiful corner of outer space. Just 6 months ago, she would have been here on the arm of Brendan Cole, her husband of 12 years. They would have navigated this glittering cosmos together, a power couple on the ascent. Tonight she was a satellite knocked from its orbit, drifting alone. Her ticket was a professional obligation, a courtesy extended to her new humbling role as a junior researcher for a small art advisory firm. It was a world away from being the co-founder and silent partner of ConnectSphere, the tech unicorn Brendan had just taken public. Her name wasn't on the IPO documents in any meaningful way, a foolish oversight born of love and trust. But her DNA was in every line of its foundational code and every late-night business plan. She had been the bedrock. He had been the face. Now the face was all that mattered. She saw him across the room holding court near the Temple of Dender. He was incandescent, a man plugged directly into the socket of success. His suit was a custom Tom Ford so sharp it looked like it could cut glass. On his arm was Tiffany Aspen, a 22-year-old influencer whose fame was as manufactured as the pout on her surgically enhanced lips. She dripped with diamonds that Josephine recognized, the very ones from a Van Cleef & Arpels collection she and Brendan had admired years ago, promising one day. Apparently one day had arrived just for a different woman. Josephine tried to make herself small to blend into the tapestries, but a voice slick with false sympathy found her. "Josie, my God, I almost didn't recognize you." It was Melinda Peterson, a woman who had once been her closest friend, now firmly a part of Brendan's new solar system. "It's so brave of you to come." Brave. The word was a tiny poisoned dart. It implied she was a wounded animal parading its injury. "It's a work event, Melinda," Josephine said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of course," Melinda purred, her eyes flicking over Josephine's simple off-the-rack black dress. "Brendan is being honored tonight, you know. A huge donation to the museum's new tech wing. He's just so generous." Before Josephine could formulate a reply, the clinking of a glass silenced the room. All eyes turned to the stage where Brendan Cole stood, beaming microphone in hand, Tiffany plastered to his side. Thank you all," he began, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "It is an incredible honor to be here, to be able to give back to this wonderful institution." He spoke for several minutes about innovation and the future, using phrases Josephine had written for him on napkins in a diner years ago. Then his speech took a personal turn. "A lot of you have followed my journey," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. For a horrifying second they locked with Josephine's. A flicker of something, was it malice? Triumph crossed his face before he looked away. "Success doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires you to shed dead weight, to make difficult but necessary cuts, to streamline your life for maximum efficiency and happiness." The air left Josephine's lungs. He wasn't talking about business. He was talking about her. Every head in the room that knew their story swiveled subtly to find her. She felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, a physical weight of pity and morbid curiosity. He then wrapped his arm tighter around Tiffany. "And it's about finding a partner who inspires you to be bigger, better, faster. Someone who represents the future, not the past. He leaned in and kissed Tiffany on the cheek, a gesture met with polite applause. So I dedicate this honor and this donation to new beginnings, to a life without compromise. The applause grew louder. It was a wave of sound that threatened to drown her. Melinda gave her a look of faux pity. Josephine could feel the whispers starting the social post-mortem of her marriage being conducted in real time. She turned her heart, a cold, heavy stone in her chest, and walked, not ran, towards the exit. She didn't look back. She passed valets bringing up gleaming sports cars, one of which was Brendan's new silver Aston Martin, a car he bought the day their divorce papers were signed. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation burning under her skin. She had been publicly, surgically, and efficiently erased. She wasn't just his ex-wife. She was his dead weight, his compromise, his past. As she hailed a yellow cab, the only thing she owned from her old life, a threadbare coat and a fierce, shattered pride, she made a silent vow. She would not break. She didn't know how, but she would survive this. She had to. Brendan had shown his new world to everyone. Now she had to build one of her own, even if it started from nothing but ashes. The months that followed the gala were a study in gray. The vibrant, saturated colors of Josephine's old life, the charity balls, the gallery openings, the Tuscan holidays, faded into a monochrome existence. Her world shrank to the size of a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a walk-up in Yorkville, a neighborhood that was technically the Upper East Side but felt a world away from the Park Avenue splendor she had once called home. The prenuptial agreement, which she'd signed without a second thought in a haze of love, had been ironclad. Brendan's lawyers had been brutal and efficient. She was left with enough to survive for a year if she was frugal, a pittance designed to feel like a mercy but function as a dismissal. Her days became a routine of quiet desperation. She would wake up to the sound of garbage trucks instead of the gentle whir of a central air system. She made coffee in a sputtering second-hand machine instead of the built-in Miele espresso maker. The city, once her playground, was now a constant, painful reminder of everything she had lost. Every restaurant, every park bench, every street corner held a memory of a life that was no longer hers. The friends she had shared with Brendan evaporated like mist. Calls went unreturned. Invitations ceased. She was a social liability, a reminder of a messy divorce that people preferred to forget. The only person who remained was Chloe, a friend from college who worked as a freelance journalist. Chloe was her lifeline, showing up at her door with cheap wine and expensive outrage. "He called you dead weight," Chloe seethed one rainy Tuesday night pacing the tiny apartment. "The man who couldn't even balance his own checkbook before you automated his entire financial life. The man whose brilliant idea for ConnectSphere was something you conceptualized in your master's thesis." Josephine just shrugged, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. "It doesn't matter, Chloe. He won. He has the money, the company, the narrative." "The narrative can be changed," Chloe insisted, her reporter instincts flaring. "We could leak the original thesis papers." "No," Josephine said firmly. "I will not be defined by him. Not as his wife and not as his victim. I just need to find my own way forward." The way forward was proving to be a steep uphill climb. Her art history degree, once a point of intellectual pride, felt useless in a world that valued scalability and profit margins. She sent out dozens of resumes to museums, galleries, and auction houses. Most went unanswered. The few interviews she landed were excruciating. The interviewers either knew who she was, their eyes filled with a thinly veiled pity, or they didn't, and questioned the 10-year gap in her employment history. "It says here you were a consultant," one interviewer at a prestigious auction house asked skeptically. "I was a foundational partner in a tech startup," she explained, trying to sound confident. "I handled strategy, initial coding, and corporate structuring." The man blinked. "But your degree is in art history. Why the shift back now?" How could she explain that she had put her own dreams on hold to build his? That she had been the architect of a life from which she was now exiled? She couldn't, so she gave a vague answer about reigniting a passion, and she never got a call back. Finally, after 3 months of dwindling savings and mounting anxiety, she caught a break. It was a small independent gallery in Chelsea Kressler Fine Arts, run by a stern, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s named Matilda Kressler. Matilda didn't care about Josephine's last name or the gossip columns. She cared that Josephine could spot the subtle inconsistencies in the brushwork of a supposed 19th century landscape painting they had on consignment. "You have a good eye," Matilda had grunted during the interview, peering at Josephine over her spectacles. "Most of the art history graduates I see these days can write a 20-page essay on gender theory in Renaissance art, but can't tell a genuine patina from a chemical wash." The job was a lifeline, but it was humbling. She was a gallery assistant and researcher, a title that meant she did everything from cataloging new acquisitions and researching provenance to making coffee and answering the phone. The pay was barely enough to cover her rent and utilities. She was 38 years old, starting over at a position usually filled by recent college graduates. There were moments of profound despair. One afternoon, while archiving old auction catalogs, she saw a photo of Brendan and Tiffany at a Sotheby's event. The caption praised his discerning eye as a new major player in the art collection world. The irony was a physical blow. Josephine had taught him everything he knew about art. She had curated the small, beautiful collection that had once hung in their home, a collection he had kept in the divorce. That evening she found herself walking aimlessly through the city. Her feet, acting on some deep subconscious memory, led her to Gramercy Park, to the block where their old townhouse stood. She stood across the street, hidden in the shadows, and looked up at the familiar windows. The lights were on, casting a warm, inviting glow. She could see silhouettes moving inside. Laughter, faint but clear, drifted out into the night. It was her home, but she was a stranger. Another woman was living her life, sleeping in her bed, enjoying the fruits of her labor. A profound loneliness washed over her, cold and absolute. It wasn't just about the money or the glamour. It was the erasure of her own history. It was as if the 12 years she had invested, loved, and built had been a dream, and she had finally brutally been shaken awake. Tears streamed down her face, hot against the cold skin of her cheeks. She was invisible. A ghost haunting the edges of a life she had created. But as she stood there shivering in the dark, a tiny resilient ember of anger began to glow within her. Anger at Brendan, at the world, but most of all at herself for ever letting her own light be so completely overshadowed by his. She would not be a ghost forever. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to be seen again. Life at the Kressler Gallery was a quiet rhythm of dust and discovery. Josephine poured herself into the work, finding a strange solace in the silent company of paintings that had witnessed centuries. Her colleagues were a small eclectic group who knew her only as Josie, the quiet but incredibly knowledgeable researcher who could trace the ownership of a Dutch still life back to the 1700s with the tenacity of a detective. For the first time in a long time, her worth wasn't tied to Brendan Cole. It was tied to her own mind. One dreary autumn afternoon, a consignment arrived that was different from their usual fare. It wasn't from a collector or another gallery, but from the estate of a recently deceased hedge fund manager. The bulk of the collection was exactly what one would expect: flashy contemporary pieces by big-name artists' investments more than expressions of passion. But tucked away in the manifest was a line item that intrigued Matilda. Lot 7B. Miscellaneous historical effects, including antique furniture, cartography, and assorted minor artworks from the Hemlock acquisition. The name Hemlock was a whisper in the art world. Arthur Hemlock was a mythical figure, a titan of industry, from the old school of Rockefeller and Carnegie, who had vanished from public life decades ago. He was rumored to be an obsessive, eccentric recluse, living somewhere in a fortified estate upstate, hoarding a legendary unseen art collection. The idea that a piece of his world, however minor, was entering their gallery was a thrilling prospect. When Lot 7B was uncrated, It was mostly junk. Dusty maps, a moth-eaten settee, and a crate of small, unremarkable paintings, mostly dull portraits and dark landscapes from unknown artists. Matilda, disappointed, assigned Josephine the tedious task of cataloging the crate's contents for minor auction. Josephine spent the next 2 days in the gallery's basement archives meticulously examining each piece. It was on the 3rd day that she found it. At the very bottom of the crate was a small, grimy painting in a simple wooden frame. It was a still life of a writing desk cluttered with books, a quill, and an overturned inkwell. It was unsigned and technically unremarkable, the kind of piece that would fetch maybe a few $100s. But something about it snagged her attention. The way the light fell on a leather-bound ledger in the center of the composition was masterful. It felt deliberate. Using a magnifying glass and a soft cloth, she began to gently clean a small corner of the painted ledger. Beneath the grime, she could just make out faint, almost microscopic lettering on its spine. Her heart began to beat faster. She spent the next hour cross-referencing the style, the canvas weave, and the chemical signature of the pigments with the gallery's database. It was a long shot, a wild, improbable guess, but the brushwork had a certain confident fluidity that reminded her of a specific school of 17th-century Dutch painters. She brought the painting upstairs to Matilda. "I think there's something more to this one," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. Matilda peered at it. "It's a competent piece, Josie, but it's nothing special." "Look at the ledger," Josephine urged, handing her the magnifying glass. "And I ran a preliminary analysis on the pigments. The cobalt blue is consistent with the type used by Johannes Vermeer's studio." Matilda froze. The name Vermeer was sacrosanct. A lost Vermeer was the art world's equivalent of the Holy Grail. "Don't be ridiculous. There are only 36 known Vermeers in the world. To think that one would be sitting in a crate of junk." "I'm not saying it's a Vermeer," Josephine corrected, her mind racing. "But what if it's not the painting itself that's important? What if the painting is a map? What if this ledger is real?" The theory was audacious. She posited that the painting wasn't just a still life, but a realistic depiction of a specific desk, and that the microscopic lettering on the painted ledger was a clue to its location or contents. It was the kind of leap that could get her laughed out of the profession, but Matilda had seen the spark of brilliance in Josephine's eyes before. "All right," she said slowly. "We'll inform the estate's lawyers of a potential anomaly that requires further investigation. But we need to be careful. The Hemlock name is attached to this." The estate's lawyers were dismissive, but they were legally obligated to follow up. They passed the query on. For 2 weeks there was silence. Josephine began to think she had made a fool of herself. Then one Thursday morning, a black car, a vintage Bentley so polished it looked like a pool of liquid night, pulled up outside the small gallery. A man in an impeccably tailored suit with the severe look of a lifelong butler entered. He did not introduce himself. "Ms. Josephine Shaw?" he asked, his voice a low baritone. "Yes," Josephine replied, her hand suddenly clammy. "Mr. Hemlock will see you now," the man said, as if she were expecting him. "Mr. Hemlock, I thought he was—" "He is very much not deceased," the man said, a flicker of dry amusement in his eyes. "The estate sale was for one of his lesser properties, a shedding of skin, as he calls it. He was intrigued by your report on the still life. He requests your presence at his home. The car is waiting." Matilda Kressler looked at Josephine, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Josephine had not discovered a lost painting. She had done something far more dangerous and far more interesting. She had gotten the attention of the dragon in his lair. As she followed the silent man out to the waiting Bentley, she felt a tremor of fear, but also a surge of exhilarating, terrifying hope. She was no longer cataloging other people's histories. She was about to step into one. The journey upstate was a 2-hour silent passage through a landscape that shifted from urban sprawl to rolling hills cloaked in autumn foliage. The Bentley moved with a serene, powerful grace, isolating Josephine from the outside world. She felt as though she were being transported to another century. The estate, when they finally arrived, was not visible from the main road. They passed through a formidable set of wrought iron gates marked only with a simple H, and drove for another 10 minutes down a winding road flanked by ancient oak trees. The house was not a modern glass and steel monstrosity, but a sprawling stone manor that seemed to have grown organically from the earth itself. It was formidable, weathered, and utterly beautiful, overlooking a vast, misty lake. The butler, whose name she learned was Peterson, led her through a grand entrance hall, not into a lavish drawing room, but down a series of quiet, book-lined corridors. The air was cool and smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and something else. Ozone, like the faint scent after a lightning strike. They finally stopped before a heavy oak door. Peterson knocked once, then opened it, gesturing for her to enter. The room was a breathtaking 2-story library, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books. A spiral staircase led to a second-floor gallery. But it wasn't the books that held Josephine's attention. Every available surface, tables, mantels, even some chairs, was covered with artifacts. Astrolabes, Renaissance sketches, Roman coins, and Egyptian statuettes. It was a museum and a laboratory all in one, and in the center of it all, seated in a high-backed leather armchair, was a man who looked as ancient and formidable as the house itself. Arthur Hemlock. He was skeletally thin, with a shock of untamed white hair and eyes that burned with a startling, ferocious intelligence. He was dressed not in a suit, but in a simple cashmere sweater and trousers. He gestured to a chair opposite him without speaking, his gaze sharp and appraising. Josephine sat her back straight, clutching her research notes. "The painting," he said, his voice a dry rasp like stones scraping together. "Tell me about it." For the next hour he grilled her. It wasn't a conversation, it was an interrogation. He didn't ask for her opinion, he demanded her reasoning. Why that specific pigment? What was the flaw in the canvas weave that suggested a later addition? How did she differentiate the brushwork from that of a known forger from the same period? He poked and prodded at every facet of her argument, his questions designed to trip her up, to expose any weakness in her logic. Josephine, fueled by adrenaline and years of repressed knowledge, met every challenge. She spoke with a passion and precision she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer Brendan Cole's ex-wife or a lowly gallery assistant. She was a scholar in her element. Finally he fell silent, steepling his long, thin fingers. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You believe the painting is a key," he stated. "I do," she confirmed. "A key to the location of the real ledger depicted within it, a record of some kind." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Peterson," he called out. The butler appeared as if from nowhere. "Bring it." Peterson disappeared into an adjoining room and returned a moment later carrying a heavy leather-bound book. It was identical to the one in the painting. He placed it on the table between them. It was the real ledger. "You were correct," Hemlock said, his voice softening for the first time. "The painting was a test, one of many I have laid out over the years. A piece of bait cast into the waters of the art world, waiting for someone with a mind, not just an eye, to notice it. You are the first." He opened the ledger. Its pages were filled not with financial records, but with meticulous handwritten notes and sketches. It was a catalog, a secret comprehensive inventory of his entire collection, a collection rumored to be one of the greatest in private hands on earth. "What you see in this house," he said, gesturing around the room, "is less than 1% of what I own. The rest is elsewhere, safe. For decades I have been a guardian, a rescuer of art that would otherwise be lost, destroyed, or locked away in the tasteless vaults of men who see it only as an asset. Men like your ex-husband." Josephine flinched at the mention of Brendan, but Hemlock continued, his sharp eyes missing nothing. "Oh, I know all about you, Josephine Shaw. I made it my business to know the moment your report crossed my desk. I know what you gave up. I know what was taken from you. I know that you, not he, possess the intellect and the soul of a true custodian." He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and beckoned for her to follow him. He led her to a section of the library wall that appeared to be solid books. He pressed a specific volume, and a section of the bookcase swung inward, revealing a climate-controlled vault. The sight that met her eyes made her gasp. Racks upon racks of paintings stood in perfectly ordered rows. It was a forest of masterpieces. She saw a Monet she knew had been missing since World War II. A Rembrandt self-portrait she had only ever seen in textbooks. A small, exquisite sculpture by Donatello. "This is my life's work," Hemlock said quietly, his voice filled with a strange mix of pride and melancholy. "And I am dying." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy as steel. "I have no heirs who care for this. Only vultures who would sell it all to the highest bidder. I need a successor, not just an owner but a guardian. Someone to continue the work, to use this collection not for personal gain, but for the preservation of beauty and history." He turned to face her, his brilliant eyes locking onto hers. "I have been testing you, Ms. Shaw, and I believe I may have found her. But this is not an offer. It is the beginning of a new, far more difficult series of tests. Are you prepared for that?" Standing in the presence of more beauty and history than she had ever imagined possible, Josephine looked at the frail, formidable man before her. He was offering her not just a job, but a purpose. A chance to build something far greater than the hollow empire she had helped create for Brendan. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I am." Outside the protected world of the Hemlock estate, another man was making inquiries. Gregory Pike, the sharp-suited manager of one of Hemlock's financial firms, had noticed the unusual summons of a minor gallery employee. Pike was a man who smelled money the way sharks smell blood, and he had been positioning himself for years to be the executor of Hemlock's vast fortune. This unexpected woman, this Josephine Shaw, was an anomaly he could not account for. And Gregory Pike did not like anomalies. He began to dig into her past, determined to find a weakness he could exploit to remove this new unexpected player from the board. The test in the labyrinth was over, but the battle for its soul was just beginning. Josephine's life transformed into a strange, bifurcated existence. By day, she was still Josie, the quiet assistant at the Kressler Gallery, a job she insisted on keeping to maintain a semblance of normalcy, and more importantly, to avoid raising suspicion. But 2 or 3 times a week, the discreet Bentley would appear to whisk her away to the Hemlock estate. These visits became her real education, a secret apprenticeship with a master. Arthur Hemlock was a demanding, irascible, and brilliant teacher. He didn't just show her his collection, he forced her to understand it on a molecular level. She learned how to detect microscopic forgeries, how to navigate the treacherous, shark-infested waters of international art auctions, and how to manage the complex legal and financial structures that protected the collection. He taught her about the secret networks he used to rescue art from war-torn regions, and the quiet philanthropies he funded. It was a global operation of breathtaking scale, all run by this one frail man from his library. With each visit, Josephine's confidence grew. The timid, heartbroken woman who had fled the Met Gala was being replaced by a calm, focused professional. She began to dress with a quiet elegance, not for others, but for herself. The hollowed-out feeling in her chest was being filled with purpose. She wasn't just learning about art, she was becoming its champion. This transformation did not go unnoticed. One evening, Chloe met her for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in their neighborhood. "Okay, Spill," Chloe said, her journalist's eyes missing nothing. "You're different. There's a light on in you that's been out for a year. You're not just surviving anymore. What's going on?" Josephine, bound by a promise of absolute secrecy to Mr. Hemlock, could only offer a partial truth. "I'm consulting on a private collection," she said. "It's significant." "Significant enough to have a vintage Bentley picking you up from work," Chloe countered, raising an eyebrow. "I saw it last week. I thought you were having an affair with some ancient billionaire." Josephine laughed, a genuine hearty laugh that felt wonderful. "Nothing like that. He's a mentor, Chloe, the kind I've been waiting for my whole life." Meanwhile, Brendan Cole's world continued its glittering trajectory. ConnectSphere's stock was soaring. He and Tiffany were the darlings of the tech and society pages, their faces plastered across magazines. Their Instagram feeds a curated fantasy of private jets, exotic beaches, and star-studded parties. Brendan had recently made headlines with his ostentatious art purchases, spending tens of millions at Christie's on flashy, obvious pieces by Warhol and Basquiat. He was building a reputation as a collector, a man of taste and influence. The collision was inevitable. It happened at a small exclusive gallery opening in Soho. Josephine was there with Matilda Kressler, while Brendan was there with Tiffany and a small entourage. He saw her from across the room and froze. He hadn't seen her in person since the gala. He had expected her to look diminished. Instead, she looked poised, elegant, and serene. She was talking to a well-known museum curator, and they were laughing. Brendan's insecurity, the toxic engine that had always driven him, flared. He couldn't stand the thought of her being happy, of her thriving without him. He swaggered over, Tiffany in tow. "Well, well, Josephine," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Crawling your way back into the scene, are we? I hope you're enjoying the canapes. Probably a step up from what you're used to these days." Josephine turned to face him. The old Josephine would have flinched, would have felt a surge of shame and anger. But the new Josephine simply looked at him with a cool, placid expression. "Brendan," she said, her tone neutral. "Tiffany, you're looking well." Her calmness infuriated him. He had wanted a reaction, a confirmation of his power over her. "I just dropped $30 million on a new de Kooning," he boasted, gesturing vaguely as if the painting were in his pocket. "You always had a good eye. You'd appreciate it. Of course, you'd have to get an invitation to the penthouse to see it." The insult was clear. "You are no longer welcome in the world you helped build." Before she could reply, a quiet voice interrupted them. "I find de Kooning's later work to be rather emotionally overwrought, don't you? All fury, no substance." They all turned. It was Peterson, Arthur Hemlock's butler, standing silently beside Josephine. He was holding her coat. No one had even seen him approach. Brendan stared at the impeccably dressed, imposing man. "And who are you?" "I am the driver," Peterson said simply. Brendan's lips curled into a cruel smirk. He looked from Peterson to Josephine, his eyes alight with malicious glee. He thought he understood. "A driver? Oh, Josie, you're dating the help. I guess you have to take what you can get. How far the mighty have fallen." Tiffany giggled. Josephine didn't even blink. The insult was so far from the truth it was absurd. She saw Brendan not as a titan, but as a small, cruel boy puffed up with money and ego. "It was good to see you, Brendan," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She turned to Peterson. "I'm ready to leave." As Peterson held the coat for her, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. It was a look of complete mutual understanding. She walked away, leaving Brendan standing there, his triumphant sneer slowly fading as he realized his words hadn't landed. He had fired a cannonball at a ghost. The encounter had an unintended consequence. It put Josephine back on the radar of Gregory Pike. Pike had been monitoring Brendan Cole, seeing him as a potential buyer for some of Hemlock's less important assets after the old man's death. He had his investigators pull the security footage from the gallery. He saw the exchange. He saw the imposing driver. He ran the plates on the Bentley. Everything clicked into place. The quiet researcher from the Kressler Gallery wasn't dating a driver. She was somehow impossibly connected directly to Arthur Hemlock himself. The threat she posed was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and immense. Pike accelerated his plans. He began using his position to subtly restrict access to Hemlock, canceling appointments with doctors he didn't control, and filtering information that reached the estate. He started a quiet smear campaign among the board members of Hemlock's foundation, painting Josephine as a manipulative gold digger, a siren who had somehow enchanted a dying, senile old man. Josephine, unaware of the corporate sharks circling, continued her work. But Arthur was growing weaker. Their sessions became shorter, his voice more strained. One afternoon, as they sat in the library looking over the secret ledger, he reached across and placed his frail, trembling hand over hers. "The work is almost done," he whispered, his brilliant eyes cloudy with pain. "There are wolves at the door, Josephine. They think I don't see them. But the lion is not yet dead. You must be ready." A chill ran down her spine. The world he had built, this priceless, beautiful legacy, was more fragile than she knew. And she was standing at its center, the unlikely guardian chosen to defend it. The final months of Arthur Hemlock's life were a race against time. The formidable Titan was fading his physical form, betraying the ferocious intellect that still burned within. His doctors, the ones Gregory Pike allowed through, spoke in hushed, somber tones. Josephine's visits to the estate became more frequent, the pretense of her life in the city falling away as the reality of her responsibilities grew. Their work shifted from art history to strategy. In the great library, which now felt more like a war room, Arthur, often propped up by pillows in his armchair, would guide her through the intricate web of his empire. He showed her the hidden accounts that funded the entire operation, the network of loyal agents across the globe, and the legal firewalls he had constructed over 50 years to protect his legacy from men like Pike and from the grasping hands of his own distant, avaricious relatives. "They see a collection of objects," he rasped one afternoon, the effort of speaking leaving him breathless. "They see price tags. They don't see the stories. They don't see the human history bound up in the canvas and stone. You do. That is why it must be you." Josephine spent hours memorizing names, codes, and protocols. She met with Ms. Albright Hemlock's fiercely loyal and razor-sharp lawyer, a woman in her 70s with a mind like a steel trap. Initially, Albright had been wary of Josephine, viewing her with suspicion. But as she witnessed Josephine's intelligence, her dedication, and her genuine love for the collection, her skepticism transformed into a formidable alliance. "Arthur has made many brilliant decisions in his life," Ms. Albright told Josephine during a private meeting. "Choosing you may be his most brilliant of all." Meanwhile, Gregory Pike's campaign was escalating. He consolidated his power within the Hemlock Foundation's board, presenting himself as the only stable hand capable of managing the transition after Arthur's inevitable passing. He commissioned a discreet psychological evaluation of Mr. Hemlock, aiming to prove diminished mental capacity. He used corporate funds to hire a private investigator to dig up any dirt on Josephine, hoping to find a scandal, an old debt, a disgruntled former colleague, anything that he could use to disqualify her. But Josephine's life had been remarkably clean, her only scandal being the quiet, dignified way she had endured her divorce. Brendan Cole, oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding, continued his public performance of success. But hairline cracks were beginning to appear in his empire. ConnectSphere's meteoric rise had been fueled by hype, and its technology was proving less revolutionary than promised. Competitors were emerging. The stock, once a rocket, was beginning to wobble. To project an image of unshakable confidence, Brendan doubled down on his lavish spending. He bought a yacht. He funded a disastrous Broadway show for Tiffany. And he continued to buy art, paying absurd headline-grabbing prices to prove he was a cultural force. The final conversation between Josephine and Arthur was quiet and profound. He was confined to his bed, the great library visible through the open doorway. The autumn light streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. "Are you afraid?" Josephine asked softly, holding his hand. It felt as fragile as a bird's wing. He was silent for a long moment. "I am not afraid of dying," he said, his voice a mere whisper. "I am afraid of being forgotten. Not me, Arthur Hemlock. The work. The idea that beauty is not a commodity but a necessity. A light. Don't let them extinguish the light, Josephine." "I won't," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "I will protect it with my life." He smiled, a faint, peaceful expression. "Good," he whispered. "Then the lion can sleep." Arthur Hemlock died 2 days later peacefully in the house he loved, surrounded by the history he had saved. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the financial and art worlds. The speculation was rampant. His fortune was estimated to be in the tens of billions, and his art collection was simply priceless. Gregory Pike immediately made his move, issuing a statement as the acting head of the Hemlock Foundation, assuring everyone of a stable and orderly transition. He summoned the distant relatives, a collection of cousins and grandnephews who hadn't seen Arthur in decades, and prepared for the reading of the will. He felt a surge of absolute triumph. He had outmaneuvered everyone. The senile old man was gone, and the nobody ex-wife would be swatted away like a fly. The reading of the will was scheduled to take place in the main conference room of the Hemlock Foundation's downtown Manhattan office. It was a cold, impersonal space, all chrome and black leather, a stark contrast to the warm, book-lined rooms of the estate. Josephine arrived alone, dressed in a simple, elegant black suit. She walked into a room thick with tension and greed. The relatives were clustered together, whispering excitedly. Gregory Pike sat at the head of the table, looking every inch the corporate king on his coronation day. He gave Josephine a dismissive, pitying smirk as she took a seat at the far end of the table. He saw her as a pathetic, deluded woman about to have her fantasy crushed. Ms. Albright entered, her face an impassive mask, and sat next to Pike. She carried a single thick, leather-bound portfolio. She cleared her throat, and the room fell silent. "We are gathered for the last will and testament of Mr. Arthur Hemlock," she began, her voice crisp and clear. "It is, I must say, a most precise and detailed document." She started with the minor bequests. The relatives leaned forward, their eyes gleaming. A second cousin was left a trust fund of $1 million. A grandnephew another $1 million. They looked disappointed, having expected much more. Peterson, the loyal butler, was granted the manor house itself and a pension that would allow him to live in comfort for the rest of his life. Then Ms. Albright turned to the foundation. "To the Hemlock Foundation," she read. "Mr. Hemlock leaves a continuing endowment of $500 million to be managed by its board of directors for its stated philanthropic purposes." Pike straightened his tie, a triumphant smile playing on his lips. He had control of the board. This was it. However, Ms. Albright continued, looking directly at him, as per the bylaws established by Mr. Hemlock, the composition of the board is subject to the discretion of the Foundation's new chairperson. Pike's smile faltered. "The new chairperson, I am the acting head." "Acting, yes," Ms. Albright said coolly. She turned to the final, most substantial section of the will. "All the rest of my estate," she read, her voice ringing with authority, "including all properties, domestic and international, all liquid assets, all stocks, bonds and controlling interests in Hemlock Industries, and most importantly, the entirety of my private art collection known as the Labyrinth Collection. I leave in its entirety not to an individual, but to a newly created trust." The room held its breath. "This trust, the Hemlock Legacy Trust," Albright continued, "is to have a single sole trustee who will hold absolute and unquestionable authority over all its assets and decisions. The Trust's mission is to preserve, protect, and selectively share the collection for the education and inspiration of the public. This sole trustee is also named effective immediately as the permanent chairperson of the Hemlock Foundation, with the full authority to dismiss and appoint board members at will." Ms. Albright paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She looked around the room at the stunned faces of the relatives, at the apoplectic, reddening face of Gregory Pike. Finally, her eyes rested on the quiet woman at the end of the table. "The sole trustee and new chairperson," she declared, her voice resonating with the finality of a gavel strike, "is Ms. Josephine Shaw." For a moment there was absolute silence. Then chaos erupted. The relatives shouted in protest. Gregory Pike leaped to his feet, sputtering about legal challenges, about undue influence, about senility. But Josephine just sat there, calm and composed amidst the storm. She wasn't a billionaire. She was a guardian, a steward, a queen of a secret kingdom tasked with a sacred mission. The legacy wasn't just money and art. It was a purpose so profound it made Brendan Cole's entire gaudy world seem like a child's sandcastle about to be washed away by the tide. She had walked into this room as an invisible woman. She would walk out as one of the most powerful and important figures in the art world. The lion was gone, but the lioness was ready to rule. The fallout from the will reading was seismic. Gregory Pike, humiliated and enraged, immediately filed a lawsuit alleging everything from diminished capacity to elder abuse. The distant relatives joined him, creating a cacophony of legal threats that made headlines in the financial press. Mysterious ex-wife inherits reclusive billionaire's entire fortune. The narrative they tried to spin was the one Pike had been cultivating for months, that Josephine was a cunning predator who had taken advantage of a lonely old man. But Arthur Hemlock and Ms. Albright had been preparing for this war for years. They had compiled a mountain of evidence to preempt any challenge. There were hours of video-recorded conversations between Arthur and Josephine where he, lucid and sharp, detailed his reasoning for choosing her. There were multiple psychiatric evaluations, all conducted by leading specialists, affirming his soundness of mind up to his final days. There was a trail of correspondence and detailed notes in his own hand outlining his grand vision and Josephine's role within it. Pike's lawsuit was not just dismissed, it was annihilated in a summary judgment. The judge was so unimpressed with his frivolous claims that he took the unusual step of ordering Pike and the relatives to pay Josephine's legal fees. Pike's career was ruined, his reputation shattered. He was fired from the foundation's board by its new chairperson, Josephine's first official act, and vanished into obscurity. While the legal battle raged in the papers, Josephine was working. She moved into the Hemlock estate not as its owner but as its custodian. With Peterson as her stoic and loyal confidant, she began the monumental task of executing Arthur's vision. She worked 18-hour days, her life a whirlwind of meetings with curators, conservators, architects, and financial advisors. She was decisive, intelligent, and utterly in command of her new role, as if she had been training for it her entire life. Her first major project was the one Arthur had dreamed of, transforming a massive abandoned warehouse he owned on the Hudson Riverfront into the public-facing wing of the Hemlock Legacy Trust. It would not be a stuffy museum, but a dynamic center for art education and conservation, offering scholarships and grants for a new generation of art historians. 6 months after the will reading, the Hemlock Center for Art and Preservation was ready for its grand opening. The event was the most sought-after invitation of the decade. The art world, the philanthropic community, and the media were desperate to finally see the legendary collection and meet the enigmatic woman who now controlled it. Josephine stood on the mezzanine of the newly renovated building, looking down at the crowd. The space was magnificent, a soaring, light-filled atrium where a select few of the collection's masterpieces were displayed for the first time. The missing Monet, the Rembrandt self-portrait. They glowed under the gallery lights, no longer prisoners in a vault, but breathing works of art shared with the world. She saw museum directors, world-famous artists, and respected critics all looking at the art with a sense of wonder and reverence. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue gown. The only jewelry she had on was a small, antique silver locket, a personal gift from Arthur. She felt a profound sense of peace. This was real. This had meaning. Across the country, Brendan Cole was in a very different place. The wobble in ConnectSphere's stock had become a full-blown plunge. A disastrous quarterly report had exposed the company's weaknesses, and the tech bubble, which had lifted so many, had selectively burst right under him. He was facing shareholder lawsuits and a federal investigation into some of his more creative accounting practices. Tiffany, seeing the writing on the wall, had decamped to Monaco with a Russian oligarch. Brendan was left alone in his glass penthouse surrounded by expensive art. He no longer appreciated watching his paper fortune evaporate. He saw the news of the Hemlock Center's opening on television. He saw Josephine, poised and powerful, being interviewed. The chyron beneath her image read, "Josephine Shaw, Chairperson, Hemlock Legacy Trust." He stared dumbfounded. He had followed the initial news of the inheritance, but he'd dismissed it, assuming the grasping relatives and the slick corporate manager he'd read about would tear her apart in court. He had assumed she'd end up with a fraction of settlement. He never imagined she would win. That she would not just inherit a fortune, but command an empire of culture and history that dwarfed his own fleeting digital one. The man who had called her dead weight now saw her as an immovable mountain. The woman he had publicly shamed was now one of the most respected and powerful philanthropists in the world. His humiliation of her at the Met Gala seemed pathetic and petty in comparison to her quiet, monumental triumph. Driven by a desperate, toxic cocktail of ego, regret, and greed, he did the unthinkable. He crashed the party. He used his still famous name to get past the outer security and slipped into the crowded atrium, a ghost at a feast he hadn't been invited to. He saw her, and for a moment the old possessiveness flared. He still saw her as his Josie, the woman who had made his coffee and typed his business plans. He approached her as she finished a conversation with the director of the Louvre. "Josephine," he said, his voice strained. She turned. There was no surprise in her eyes, no anger, just a faint, weary recognition. "Brendan, you shouldn't be here." "I had to see it for myself," he stammered, looking around at the priceless art. "Josie, what you've done. It's incredible. We always talked about doing something like this, remember? It was a pathetic attempt to rewrite history to insert himself into her narrative." "No, Brendan," she said, her voice soft but firm as steel. "You talked about buying things. This isn't about buying. It's about preserving." "I get that now," he said, moving closer. "I've made mistakes. I was an idiot. The money, the fame. It went to my head. I lost the most important thing in my life. I lost you." His eyes were pleading. Maybe we could start again? We were always a great team." Josephine looked at this man, this shell of a person whose entire identity was built on wealth and status, both of which were now crumbling. She felt nothing. Not hatred, not love, not even pity. Just nothing. He was a stranger from a former life, a ghost whose power over her had long since vanished. "You're right about one thing," she said. "We were a team. I was the architect and you were the salesman. But I'm not building for you anymore, Brendan." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm finality was more devastating than any shout. "The person you're looking for doesn't exist anymore," she continued. "You erased her, and I should thank you for that, because the woman who grew in her place is infinitely stronger." She gave him a small final nod, a gesture of dismissal, not of farewell. Then she turned her back on him and walked away, moving through the crowd to greet a group of scholarship students, their young faces bright with awe and excitement. She was their future. Brendan stood alone in the middle of the grand hall, a relic of a past she had transcended. He was surrounded by $1 billion worth of beauty, but all he could feel was the crushing weight of his own worthlessness. He had tried to execute her publicly, but he had only succeeded in executing himself. Josephine Shaw didn't need to walk away with a billionaire legacy to win. She just needed to walk away from him. The legacy was simply the universe's way of balancing the books. In the end, Brendan Cole's world of flashing cameras and fleeting stock prices crumbled to dust, a cautionary tale of a man who gained a fortune and lost his soul. But for Josephine Shaw, her story was never about the money. It was about reclaiming a voice that had been silenced and a purpose that had been buried. The billionaire legacy she inherited wasn't a prize. It was a responsibility she had unknowingly been preparing for her entire life. She transformed her pain into power, her knowledge into a gift for the world, proving that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or shiny possessions, but in the legacy of beauty, knowledge, and kindness you leave behind. She didn't just get a new life. She built a new world, one where her value was finally indisputably her own. If Josephine's incredible journey from heartbreak to triumph inspired you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to start over and build something magnificent. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories of resilience, justice, and the ultimate victory of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.